when you put hormones in your body, even if you perceive they are at a physiological dose, it has to be the physiological dose for where you are in your reproductive timeline. And there are so many different influencing factors. I know when we were talking on message before the show a couple days ago, I had said, like, one of the things that there is a group of researchers suggesting that the more you mess around with your hormones in your reproductive prime, you might be at a predisposition to go through a more tumultuous menopausal, perimenopausal
That makes
state.
a lot of sense.
And it does to me too, because when you think about if somebody is, say, on a contraceptive agent and they are not ovulating for a very long period, let's say 10 years of their life,
10
they're not
years,
ovulating,
yeah.
right?
Quite often.
Quite often, exactly, because then they go off the pill. Say they started on 18, they go off at 28, wanting to have kids. Well, you haven't ovulated in 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of egg reserve that you now have that you need to dump before you go through into like menopause or the end, because that is essentially what our body is doing. Is we have a set amount of eggs that we have since birth, and when we go through our period, we're supposed to be either fertilizing, which is pregnancy, or not, therefore dropping. So if all of a sudden you are holding on to all these eggs and your body, it's natural, normal, I mean, there's some really cool work done in like ancestral or evolutionary biology slash like physiology that have said, like, you're holding on to something that your body from an evolutionary perspective doesn't want to have anymore. It doesn't want those eggs anymore because you should be done. Your whole body is on almost like a circadian clock. Mm-hmm. And that when that clock is now winding down, it's going to be like, I need to get rid of these eggs. Get. And so when I first came across that theory about 5-6 years ago, I was like, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Similarly, when young girls have a very tumultuous puberty, they often also have more of a harder time having regular ovulatory cycles in their reproductive prime because you're laying this foundation. One of the things that, like the metaphors, I guess, that I use that I feel has been very successful in the past with explaining this process is comparing your like the hormonal symphony of sorts in the process of a woman's reproductive cycle with a symphony, like an orchestra, and that you have, I mean, you think about puberty as being a bunch of musicians all coming together to try to start playing together, playing this beautiful song. Well, I don't know about you. I was in band in grade 7, and I was so bad that my band teacher actually told me, do not play at our Christmas concert, because I was so bad.
Poor you.
But it was like a cruel metaphor for, I think, what actually my hormones ended up doing. But anyways, and so the hormones, the symphony of the hormones, the song that you're playing, you not only have one across your reproductive life cycle, but each month or however long your normal natural menstrual cycle is. So you're playing kind of this rhythm where you've got these highs and lows, just like in a song, of hormones doing all different things, but they're working together to create some type of outcome, whether that is for fertility's sake, whether that is to, we know that hormones are estrogen and progesterone have such an important effect on bone health. So they can be playing this song to actually help us create and preserve our bones. And that at the end of the reproductive life cycle, menopause, it's like the song stops playing. It's done. You've gone down. So with the human body, there's argument that we have kind of this set, almost like a metronome that's keeping the beat of what our cycle should be doing each month. And it's ticking back and forth. And as the body goes into this perimenopause and then menopause, it's like the metronome starts ticking a little bit slower and slower and slower. And so the orchestra now is forced to play differently than when it was in kind of the peak of the song, which would be the reproductive prime. Okay. So in puberty, if, say, an individual goes on a contraceptive agent and they're not done actually creating these foundations, it would be like having this orchestra and having a drummer who is one of the crucial people to keeping the beat, that's like your ovarian axis, taken away. So you've taken this drummer away. The orchestra is still playing, but something is missing. It's not sounding, it's not working as optimally as it should be anymore.
Yeah.
And now, let's say at 20, let's say they started on a contraceptive agent at 14, and then they go back on at, or try to go off at 28. Well, it would be like now you've got this drummer, you've got this orchestra that's continued to play together. They're getting good at harmonizing, meaning even though they're missing a integral component, so they're still not quite right. That drummer is now being added back into the mix. And the drummer hasn't practiced over that span of time. So they're going, I don't know what to do. You're all playing beautifully, but I don't even know how to hold my drumsticks.
That's insane.
Because I've been taken out of the equation. And so that's why a lot of women do experience some pretty chaotic kind of hormonal and overall just physiological dysfunctions of sorts when they go off a hormonal contraceptive, when they've been on it for a long period of time and started it in this critical kind of phase of our reproductive creation. And so with that being said, now that drummer might be able to, through, you know, a lot of management, begin actually playing in harmony with this orchestra. But nevertheless, we don't know what the implications of that are as we get into the end of the metronome. And that's where some theorists will argue it's why women that have kind of had these reproductive either disturbances or introduced certain agents that have maybe kind of created these disturbances can have more of a tumultuous perimenopausal and then menopausal period. And so when women have like their orchestra that say goes out of tune, it's similar to when a menstrual cycle is kind of out of tune. Literally, is you're maybe having heavier bleeding, or you're having irregular cycles, or you're having breakthrough or cramping or whatever it might be. And that when a symphony is out of tune, it doesn't mean that we should take away components of it. Mm-hmm. It means we have to figure out what components aren't playing to tune, whether that is something like stress hormones, whether that's digestion, whether that's something like nutrient status, or maybe it's an external stress. I know I have some pretty bad ADD at times. And if I was trying to play an instrument and there was, say, noise going on in the background, it would be really likely that I'm now going to go off beat.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you have tried to get somebody to do multitasking. It's really hard to do. And that external stress is like when we have external stress and our menstrual cycle gets thrown off a little bit, because it's really hard to keep that tune, to keep that harmony when we're not making optimal settings for it.
Gotcha.
So there are ways to help and to improve women's reproductive life cycle at any phase. Some of them people don't like to hear because they're so simple and so practical that they seem like not important. But sleep is something that can be absolutely vital to not only the beginning phases of a reproductive life cycle, but as we're in our prime, and then as we enter something like perimenopause and then menopause, that we know that sleep helps to create and maintain hormonal homeostasis. And so if we're not having regular, or we're not having sleep that is able to do like the function that it's supposed to do, that can throw all of this off.
Absolutely.
I mean, even the relationship between neurotransmitters and our hormones, it's called the neuroendocrine system. And so when somebody has something, let's say like a lack of self-esteem and not great social relationships, that influences our neurotransmitters. Our neurotransmitters influence our reproductive hormones. So there's so many different intricate pieces to this, so many different moving parts. And what we are seeing at this point in kind of at this moment in history is we are seeing a couple distinctive things with women's health over their reproductive life cycle. We are seeing more women that are having hormonal disturbances at any point, whether that's really just crazy PMS while in puberty, or really early onset of menstruation, ovulatory disturbances, rates of endometriosis, fibroids, menstrual pain, heavy
PCOS.
bleeding, infertility, breast cancer. We're seeing rates going up and up and up. And some would argue that it's because more people are actually just talking about their menstrual cycle.
Yeah.
Whereas others would argue that, like, no, actually, there's something else going on here, whether that's environmental toxins and like EDCs, whether it is looking at things like just the stress, the sheer stress that at this point in history, humans have on their bodies from external and internal things. I mean, inability to digest food, all the way to actually manipulating our hormones with agents that we really shouldn't be using. Genetic different variations, whether it's, say, in enzymes that are helping to metabolize our hormones to those that are helping to bind our hormones. There is just so many different elements going on here, but I can say that it's not, even though it's been normalized, it's not okay. It's not okay that we're having this huge rate of reproductive disturbances. And often the solution is something like a hormonal contraceptive agent, which is incredibly problematic, because when we start stripping away the pieces of this puzzle, we can see that something like a contraceptive agent has it was created for a very specific reason. It was for contraceptive reasons, which means to stop somebody from being able to be fertile. So, however, it's been over, actually, right from the get-go, pretty much, to be honest, like right in the 1930s, it was started to be used as a tool to treat certain hormonal dysfunctions or reproductive dysfunctions, which just doesn't make sense at all. And that's something that I think is really important for viewers to remember in something like perimenopause, that it's so important to be on the right protocol, because there's so much misinformation, even down to the drugs being given, that can have such a profound impact on somebody's fertility, cancer rates, blood clot rates, ability to even have like a healthier perimenopause and a less crazy menopausal period. Bone density is a huge one that I see with a lot of my work, because of the importance of something like ovulation. And that when we think about the role of ovulation, I mean, there's lots of different reasons behind why the body ovulates, but it creates the majority of women's progesterone.
Yes, yeah.
And so if we're not creating most of our progesterone, whether that's because we're on an agent that's stopping us from doing that, or because we have something else going on, then that's something that has to be addressed. And there's pharmaceutical ways to do that that are healthier and more sustainable. And then there are ways to do that that just don't make any sense at all. At all. Like, I try to rationalize what physicians do, and I'm like, I don't understand where the thinking is. It just doesn't make sense.
They're giving, and I mean, you can see that quite often in perimenopause. There, you go in and you complain with perimenopause symptoms, and the first thing you want to give you is an oral contraceptive, or Mirena. I spoke to a lady who said that she went in her late 40s, and they're like, okay, I'm going to put you on Mirena. And she's like, no, I would just like progesterone or estrogen. And she's like, oh, it's the same thing. No.
And so one of the things I did, I think this would have been last year at an event I spoke at, was I was like, you know what, I'm going to try, before I even went to the event, I'm like, I'm going to try to like map, what are all the drugs, like what are all the hormone affecting reproductive steroids that women are going on throughout their hormonal life cycle, which then I realized that acronym was HERS. And I was like, perfect. Okay, I'm going to run with this. So when you think about the subcategories, there's contraceptives, hormonal contraceptives, there's fertility drugs, there's drugs that are given for hormonal dysfunction, reproductive disorders, oncological treatments, osteoporosis, dermatological issues, hormone therapy, anti-aging, performance enhancement, and then, I mean, a host of others. So there's a lot of different reasons why somebody's going to look towards going on a hormone affecting reproductive steroid. And there are classes of these. I mean, there's numerous different classes. You've got women that go on, let's say, a progesterone receptor agonist, which would be something like a natural microized progesterone or a progesterone. And a progesterone is not the same as progesterone.
No.
So progesterone, so there's some weird wording things with progesterone that I think throw off a lot of people. But essentially you've got, so progesterone, I don't necessarily need to do a spelling thing, but it's Progesterone. Progesterone. This is the hormone that we create in our body, men and women both. It's a critical reproductive hormone. Now, hormones that act like progesterone are spelled Progestogen, or sometimes there's no O and they use an A or an E instead, depending on what or like country of origin it is.
Okay.
Then there are exogenous progesterones that are created, and a synthetic progesterone is actually called a progesterone, or Progestin. Progesterones just don't work the same as progesterone within the body. It's like a wolf wearing sheep's clothing. It might look a little bit, but once you start digging into it, it's not the same effect. And then there's also bioidentical progesterone, which is something like prometrium.
Yeah.
And I can get into prometrium maybe a little bit later. But so as you can see, there's a lot of different kind of confusion, even just with something like that. And I think that is one of the reasons why doctors will give something like a progesterone, a synthetic progesterone, in an instance where they shouldn't be at all, because it's not actually bioidentical to what the body needs. So there's also, androgen receptor, just going back to kind of that HERS, there's androgen receptor agonists. These are like testosterone and synthetic testosterone or synthetic androgens. There are estrogen receptor agonists. So estradiol esters is, that's the easiest one to kind of bring up. Then you also have, for all three of those, there are antagonists. There are also selective receptor modulators for each of those. There's also steroid synthesis inhibitors. Then there's also what's called a non-steroidal hormonal agent that still acts on our reproductive hormones. So things like a gonadotropin agonist or a gonadotropin antagonist. These are often given now in something like endometriosis.
Yeah.
And then we also have gluco or mineral corticoids, which are another type of steroid. That's one of our steroid families, not necessarily related to like the reproduction, yet they still influence our reproduction hugely. And these can be either a progesterone or a derivative of a progesterone. This would be something like spironolactone or aldactone, which is used in an anti-androgenic purpose. However, its molecular structure and how it works, we still don't really understand how it actually blocks certain hormones. So that kind of gives you like this overview. There's this massive group of drugs. And in each of these different categories, we can break it down even more. We can look at, let's just say with a progesterone, there's ethylated, there's non-ethylated, there's derivatives of certain forms of progesterone. There's 19 NORs. So there is a bunch of different drugs in each of these different classes. And then there's also a bunch of different routes of entry: pill, patch, injection, intrauterine, vaginal ring, cream, exactly. And even with something like cream, there's different places you can put it on your body.
Yeah.
So it's confusing. Like, even as a researcher in this field, it's confusing. Yeah. There's a lot going on here. And so for, the everyday person that's thinking about utilizing, let's say, some type of therapeutic use of hormone therapy, whether it's testosterone replacement or what I called at the beginning, ovarian hormone therapy, there are specific drugs, specific protocols that are going to be better suited for different types of symptomology, but also for different places in your reproductive life cycle. And that, to me, is absolutely vital to remember, as what is the purpose of going on the drug, right? So that individual you mentioned, so being told to go on something like a Mirena, which is a hormonal IUD, in perimenopause for the symptom of heavy bleeding, that just doesn't make sense from a long-term standpoint. It's interesting because one of my mentors had said to me, because we talked about that whole exact case study years ago, and she was like, you know what I've learned in all my years of clinical practice? Women who have that often are in a rude awakening once they actually get the IUD out, because they almost get this kickstart where they go back into perimenopause. They think that it's all good and dandy, but it's because you've just essentially band-aided the effect. And that's no different than a woman, let's say at 30 years old, that gets put on a oral contraceptive because she has heavy cramping. It's not looking at the underlying reason. It's just blanketing it and giving this mass-produced cure-all that really isn't actually a cure-all. It's like turning the lights off. It's shutting down an axis with not actually dealing with the underlying factor and not putting it into the context of the individual and what factors have maybe led them to that and what factors we're going to look at later on in life. So where are they in their reproductive timeline? Are they wanting to conceive? Yeah. What age are they? And are they wanting to conceive in the future? Are they somebody who has, so because our hormones are influenced by so many different things in our body, are they maybe somebody that has a high level of adipose? They're obese. We know that influences our hormones. Fat is an adipose organ. Yeah. Do they have some type of liver dysfunction going on? What's their stress levels? So if we don't start to tease apart these first, literally when we're going on some type of exogenous hormone, we're just blanketing that. Yeah. It's absolutely not sustainable.
So would you say then women who think that, okay, so I know you were saying that the symptoms that we think are low estrogen could be high estrogen. So if you're saying, so someone in their late 30s, they're having migraines all the time at the time of their cycle, would that be more estrogen dominance and that they shouldn't, because I know a lot of them are running to estrogen right away. I need to supplement with estradiol. Is that just so at a balance later?
Yeah. So one of the things that's important to remember is that our hormones, and this is, I think, even with serum testing where sometimes people or any type of lab testing kind of go wrong, is that it's not necessarily about the levels are critical. They're important. Don't let me understate those. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's the ratios too that are really important. It's the ratios of estrogen to progesterone. They are like yin and yang. Typically speaking, when estrogen is high, progesterone's low, and you're in a state of inflammation. And this is the acronym that I kind of, I guess, coined of sorts, but HELP. High estrogen, low progesterone. It's caused by inflammation. That has several different ways to fix it. You can fix the inflammation. You can also change the ways in which you're metabolizing estrogen, because it's usually not that you are actually creating too much estrogen. It's an issue of metabolizing it. Sometimes the liver is your suspect, and fixing both your liver, your blood glucose response, getting your cholesterol back in line, getting your liver enzymes where they need to be, figuring out why your SHBG, which is the sex hormone binding globulin, is through the roof, because it's usually high in a state when you're not binding your androgens properly. And things like, obesity, insulin, hypothyroidism, these are all things that can change the ways in which you're binding your hormones properly. So going straight on something like estrogen doesn't make sense when we look at kind of what's going on. It would be interesting to know whether or not those women ovulate. And again, this goes back to why it is so critical for women to track their menstrual cycle. It is so critical. And it's not for because I work with a lot of athletes, of course, and people right now, it's kind of in vogue tracking for performance. And I'm like, no, it's tracking for health. Because if you're not ovulating, you're not creating most of the progesterone your body needs. If you're not creating most of the progesterone your body needs, estrogen is now your yin and yang. You've just thrown that off. Some individuals will experience lower estrogen depending on the setting, but I would argue that many are actually in a state of high estrogen. And after you deal with all of those factors, as I mentioned, diet and sleep and everything else, if you're still not ovulating, cyclical progesterone is what you want to go towards. Why? Because we are using an ovarian hormone therapy to actually go to the root cause. If your estrogen, or not, let's not even look at our estrogen, let's just look at ovulating. If you're not ovulating, you're not creating your progesterone. So let's give you some progesterone in a cyclical format. Let's mimic what your body should be actually doing. And what it should be doing is at that, so your menstrual cycle is 2 phases. First phase, luteal, estrogen highest. Second phase, if you've ovulated, follicular now, or sorry, other way around, follicular,
Luteal.
estrogen. Luteal is when your progesterone has been created. Progesterone is now the highest. So if you're not ovulating, you're not making enough progesterone. So giving somebody a treatment with a natural progesterone hormone, like an oral micronized progesterone, Nutrien, even there is a synthetic type of progesterone that can be created that resembles natural progesterone. But if you can go more of the natural route, it's usually a little bit more expensive. It is, though, giving your body what it actually needs. And that will now work on all the tissues in your body, unlike some of the synthetic progesterones that are only going to work in your ovarian complex. And that's one of the big differences, is that a synthetic progesterone, for example, like norethindrone acetate, it's only going to work where it was produced to work and it was created as a contraceptive agent. Therefore, it's not going to have benefit for your bone density.
Yeah.
It's not. And so with cyclical progesterone, it's given typically during day 14 to 27 to mimic that normal timing of progesterone. The action is to try to create this, emulate what progesterone would be doing with an ovulatory cycle. Usually it's given at bedtime because that's when we are getting our surge, and about 300 milligrams is typically speaking, and I don't give out numbers often on things like this, but typically speaking, that's what you see. And it can be
all
used.
Of it doesn't get absorbed, right?
Correct. Yeah. And typically speaking, in the pre-menopause, so in pre-menopause, not even in perimenopause, but I'm talking like the reproductive prime, it can be used as treatment for something like absent periods or regular periods, heavy bleeding, severe menstrual cramps, women who aren't ovulating, because ovulation is so important. And there can be lots of different root causes. So I do emphasize that people should find out what the root cause of that is. Anovulatory or even short or insufficient luteal phases. So that's when women will have a very short second half of their cycle. There are like these funny little incidences that are almost, I would say, subclinical, that they're not often paid attention to, but they don't happen when you're having regular hormonal, endocrine, neuroendocrine, systemic milieu. They're just not going to happen. So you need to figure out why that's not happening. Anovulation, so actually having a menses, is not a marker of you ovulating. So women can experience a bleed, but this is an anovulatory cycle, and it's popular. I mean, it is incredibly popular. Some of the research has said that up to 30, what was the study? It was, I got to remember this. It was a massive study that was done in Norway a couple of years ago, 2016. It was like 27,000 women were studied, but they found that only 3,500, 4,000 of them actually had regular ovulatory cycles, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And the other women, because they had to kind of like exclude this massive group of women because they weren't having regular ovulatory periods, or they had hysterectomies, they were on ovarian therapy. They were already starting perimenopause, whatever. There was a lot of exclusion, which just goes to show you that there's the variance. Women were aged, I think, 22. I want to say it was like 41, maybe.
Oh, wow.
And the average menstrual cycle length of this study, and this is kind of what research is saying, is anywhere between 20 to 21 days and about 35 days.
Oh, wow.
And so the average, when we average that, that's why people get that 27 or 28 day cycle. But that doesn't mean that women are supposed to have a 28-day cycle. That's nearly an average that's been created from kind of these big data, big population studies. And unfortunately, something like the birth control pill that came out in the early 1960s was created on a 28-day cycle, which is ingrained in people's minds that we're supposed to have now a 28-day cycle, which just is not the case at all. Ovulatory disturbances are really, they're a thing. They are incredibly popular. I'm personally, even as a women's reproductive health researcher that knows a lot about this stuff, I know that, like, my mom passed away a year ago. After my mom passed away, I was not going to expect myself to have an ovulatory cycle.
No.
I was under so much stress. I was in the deep pits of grieving. My body was not in a physiological place to make a baby, to be fertile.
That's a very good point.
It was not in a place to do that. I mean, going back to evolutionary biology or physiology, we think about the reasons why, like from a very bare bones basic thing, why do women ovulate? They ovulate to be able to be fertile. Mm-hmm. And ovulation is an incredibly important thing for many different functions in the body. But just stripping it down, it's like that is why women ovulate and men don't. Right? It's why we actually have this menstrual cycle. It's why we have eggs. It's why we have these cyclical hormones, is to promote the ability, because women's bodies are incredible. Men don't make humans. We make humans with our bodies, right? Like that's a big difference that sometimes gets forgotten.
I was blown away last year with what my body did.
Exactly. Such a beautiful thing. And so there are lots of different reasons why somebody might be predisposed to anovulatory cycles. I know personally, it's for why I got into this field of work is I, as a kid, had these crazy reproductive like bombs of sorts, like put on contraceptive at a young age, had an eating disorder, had shut down different axes. Then my body rebelled once I came off because all of a sudden it didn't know what to do. Was an athlete, was a high, like in a very high stress kind of world with university and just working in the professional world, like all these different things that textbooks say. And I don't actually mean textbooks, but like are the textbook versions of why somebody is not going to have an ovulatory cycle. Then there's also genetic components in there too. Yeah. There's nutrient components in there too. There's comorbidities. And so I think that's where we need to be aware that although women need to have ovulatory cycles, it's not uncommon for them to not have an ovulatory cycle. Yeah. And we need to know the reasons why and then address that in a very systematic way. If a female has high estrogen and no progesterone being produced by the ovulation, it doesn't make sense to give her estrogen. It just doesn't make sense. Now, if somebody has low estrogen and low progesterone, then doing an ovarian therapy of both in the cyclical manner makes sense from a clinical basis. Yeah. Now, in perimenopause and in menopause, things are going to be different because we're not expecting women to have a ovulatory cycle at the end of perimenopause and in menopause, because that, like going back to our symphony, that's not what our body is doing. Yeah. So there are ways to kind of manipulate, ovarian therapy, whether it's even just progesterone based. Typically what you see is in very early menopause, a very early perimenopause, that is a tongue twister, cyclical progesterone, women can manipulate that based off of where their symptoms are. And sometimes women do need to add in some estrogen towards the end of perimenopause. Okay. It has been found that it can be useful for something like night sweats, but that you don't necessarily, like in perimenopause, that cyclical progesterone usually is going to be on a longer cycle, so a 21 day, or for 3 months straight, and then you go off and you see what happens. You got to see what actually where you're at. In menopause, it's not unheard of for women to remain on progesterone. However, important that they're going off estrogen, unless it is something that has been indicated for them based off of, say, their hormonal needs. And one of the reasons for that is that in menopause, women aren't supposed to have high levels of estrogen circulating like that at all. Yeah. And so you are going against, and this is, I think, where the TRT, HRT community really needs to think critically about that. When you put hormones in your body, even if you perceive they are at a physiological dose, it has to be the physiological dose for where you are in your reproductive timeline. And there can be a drawback because the rest of your body is aging. If your rest of your body is aging and your reproductive hormones are jacked up, so you're now super physiological for your age, the implications of that have not yet been fully demonstrated. I mean, we can hypothesize something even like the liver as you age, glucose regulation as you age. Those are going to have impacts on how you're metabolizing hormones. And if you're all of a sudden supercharging, then that can get really scary because you're throwing something. It's like, going back to that orchestra, it would be like your orchestra is getting tired.
Yeah.
They're slowing down and you're like, hey, play this song. And it's a really complicated song, right? There's going to be some chaos happening. There's going to be some confusion happening.